Hey guys, welcome to PCA Distance Learning. This is American History, Chapter 29, Eisenhower, Moderate Republican. Lesson 138, The Fight for Equality. A quick word here, we're not going to get the time to cover all of the lessons in Chapter 29. This is the only one we're going to do. But I thought that the civil rights movement in the 50s was so important to understanding the civil rights movement in the 60s that we had to separate it out and fit it in. So this is being grouped together with Chapter 28 and Truman. Okay, as World War II and then the Korean War draw to a close, there are a couple of worldwide developments. One of those is the Cold War. The red team, led by the Soviet Union, against the blue team, led by the United States. At the same time, we're seeing the process of decolonization, what is sometimes referred to as the retreat from empire. And that certainly picks up speed after the Suez Crisis of 1956. And what that decolonization process means is that we're going to see emerging nations looking at both the Soviet Union and the United States to see how they treat their citizens, to see which side they wish to join or perhaps align with. Certainly, our Declaration of Independence contains the glorious idea that all men are created equal. In practice, however, a certain portion of the country had treated a section of our citizens as decidedly unequal. What are we going to do to fix that? Before we get to the Brown case of 1954, let's take a minute and get back to the foundational Plessy case that had been in effect for about 60 years. In the aftermath of the American Civil War, the period of Reconstruction saw three new constitutional amendments, 13, 14, and 15. 13 said no slavery, 15 said blacks vote, and 14 had kind of a smorgasbord of ideas, among which was the notion that states owed citizens equal protection under the law, that there was an equal right to citizenship regardless of race. Now, as Reconstruction draws to a halt, there's something of a reconciliation. Guys in blue and guys in gray stop hating each other quite so much. But the South determined to maintain white superiority, and the North sort of gave up trying to make the South change. And so in southern states, we get a series of laws requiring racial segregation. We call these laws collectively Jim Crow laws. Now, as far as education is concerned, all southern states used or paraphrased Mississippi laws of 1878, Chapter 13, Section 35. White and colored pupils shall not be taught in the same schoolhouse, but in separate schoolhouses. Now, the Plessy case will move this idea from jello to concrete. And Plessy was an individual of mixed race background who wanted to use a railroad car in Louisiana, which had separate railroad cars according to race. And the white railroad car was substantially nicer than the black car. He went to the white car. He was ordered to move to the black car. He refused that order, and he would be arrested, and he would challenge the constitutionality of the Louisiana statute. The railroad paid for his defense lawyer because they wanted him to win. They didn't want to have white male bathrooms, black male bathrooms, white female bathrooms, black female bathrooms. God bless. If we'd had transgender in the 19th century, we'd have had 8 bathrooms per train station. Ultimately, the railroad is going to be forced to uphold separate but equal. Plessy is going to lose. And this transportation case ended up impacting education. And it meant that the existence of separate schools and the doctrine of separate but equal upheld the notion that there could be two ways to treat people by color. Now, they were really, really good at separate. They were not nearly as good at equal. White cars, more likely to have upholstery on the seats, more likely to have carpet on the floor, more likely to have glass in the windows. Now, you can make the point, I guess, that at the very least, there's a recognition you can't have a white-only railroad, and it meant that blacks could buy train tickets and travel to wherever they wanted. But their accommodations were not nearly equal to the white accommodations. Now, the group that's going to challenge this separate but equal doctrine will be the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, founded by William Edward Burkhard Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois, in 1908. And the NAACP will follow a court strategy to attack laws that they opposed, rather than trying to work through state legislatures or the National Congress. And what's going to happen is we're going to get a series of decisions at the baccalaureate and graduate levels that will destroy segregation in advanced learning. Starts with the Murray case of 1935. The University of Maryland denied blacks the opportunity to attend their state school and offered them as a replacement $200 to be used toward out-of-state tuition. And the Supreme Court ruled that that was not equal. The Gaines case in 1938. The University of Missouri gave blacks a stronger alternative. They offered a full payment for out-of-state tuition. And the court said, well, for people that want to conduct business or study law inside the state of Missouri, that's still not equal. The Sipple case, a decade later, 1948, the University of Oklahoma denied blacks the opportunity to attend and said that they had not exhausted the remedy of requesting an all-black school. It took the Supreme Court very little time to reject that as an equal alternative. And sort of the last gasp of separate but equal at the graduate level was going to be in 1950, the University of Texas Law School denied blacks the opportunity to attend, and a Texas state court had said that that could no longer stand, and that Texas had 6 months to create an alternative. And so they requisitioned a couple of $1 million, bought land and buildings, stocked it with law books, hired professors, and created an ad hoc law school. And the Supreme Court said, okay, on the one hand, we have a facility which is recognized as one of the top half dozen in our entire country, been around for a couple hundred years. All the procedures are in place and smooth and operating. And on the other hand, we have this very temporary, hastily thrown together program, not equal. And so at this point, it's clear that separate but equal is gone. But really, that wasn't creating a lot of fear. Parents weren't terribly excited about what was happening to their 25 and 30-year-old children compared to parents watching Johnny and Susie go to school at 5 and 6 and 7 and 8. K through 12 still had separate but equal. Now, before the Supreme Court can get a case, Eisenhower is going to have 3 Supreme Court appointments: Hugo Black and William O. Douglas, and perhaps most importantly, former California Governor Earl Warren, who will become the Chief Justice and serve in that position from 1953 to 1969. They are going to receive Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, which is actually going to take a series of related cases and kind of meld them together into a single entity. The Brown family is going to argue that their daughter should not have to walk halfway across the city to a colored school. She ought to be able to attend the nicer and much more convenient and much safer to travel to neighborhood white school, and that it should be integrated. Brown's lawyer is going to be Thurgood Marshall. He'll be a major player in the civil rights movement, and ultimately he will be the first black to serve on the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, when the Supreme Court rules on this case, they will be unanimous. It's 9-0. And that says to those reading the ruling, don't ask us to overturn this because a justice gets replaced. It's not close. This is not 5-4 or 6-3. This is the way we're going to work from now on. Now, in May of 1954, the Supreme Court came out with the first half of a two-part ruling, and it said that segregated public schools, separate but equal, was unconstitutional. So that pulled out the old system. What they didn't do immediately is say what was going to replace it. In fact, they invited remedy briefs from interested observers suggesting it was going to take a bit of thought to figure out what would come next. Now, the NAACP pushed for an answer of immediate desegregation. In the fall, all schools, all grades, time now. And they said, look, the rednecks in the South are going to argue for gradual desegregation. And they're going to play games. And if they're allowed to, they'll string this out into the 21st century. The federal government, led by President Eisenhower, is going to try to balance a number of ideas. Eisenhower believed that segregation was wrong. He believed that states had the right to control the education process. This seemed to be very clearly what was recorded in Article 1, Section 8 in the 10th Amendment. He believed it was going to take a period of time to adjust from the Jim Crow laws of the past to this new idea that Jim Crow was unconstitutional. And in 1955, the Supreme Court came out and said that integration would go forward with, quote, all deliberate speed. I've always found that phrase to be a little bit ambiguous. What exactly is deliberate speed? When runners are participating in a relay, they're not looking for deliberate speed. They're looking for maximum speed. They are working their lungs and their muscles to the utmost to get around the track. Deliberate speed, to me, makes me think of church and the ushers coming down the aisle to pass out the collection plates. They're moving with deliberate speed. It's perhaps faster than glacial, but it's certainly not a run. Billy Graham said, I believe the Lord is helping us, and if the Supreme Court will go slowly and extremists on both sides will quiet down, we can have a peaceful social readjustment over the next 10-year period. Now, Southerners were not happy with this. Some were wondering how it's going to work. Others were determined rather quickly to take the position that they were going to stop any sort of federally forced desegregation. South Carolina voted to close the schools if ordered to desegregate. The governor of Georgia appointed a commission to advise him on how best to avoid desegregation. This has become a serious political issue in the South. Politicians are going to have to get right on this one if they want to get reelected. Any politician in the South who was not publicly opposed to racial integration was likely to be voted out of office. The Southern Manifesto came out in March of 1956. 100 different Southern congressmen would sign this, and it was basically a pledge to attempt to work to overthrow the Brown versus Board of Education decision and to reestablish separate but equal. Now, this will come to a peak in Little Rock, Arkansas at Central High School. The local school board had filed a desegregation plan, which called for a beginning in May of '55 and completion in 1963. And under that plan, in the fall of 1957, 9 blacks were scheduled to attend Central High School. They were all chosen for superior academics and citizenship. The Arkansas governor called in the National Guard to block integration, citing the potential violence from local parents. President Eisenhower met Governor Faubus. Faubus assured him he would remove the National Guard and allow integration to proceed smoothly. Faubus appeared to have deceived the president. When the Guard was removed, the local parents were there with axe handles and baseball bats and in some cases shotguns and prevented the students from attending Central High School. Mayor Woodrow Wilson Mann requested federal troops. Eisenhower federalized the Arkansas National Guard, sent them out on maneuvers, and brought in 1,000 paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division. Now, the last time we talked about the 101st Airborne, they were holding the city of Bastogne while surrounded by 7 German panzer divisions. The local rednecks realized rapidly that axe handles and baseball bats were not going to stop an airborne division. Eisenhower returned control of the Arkansas Guard to Governor Faubus. In November of that year, after school had been operating for several months peaceably, he pulled out the paratroopers at the end of the month of November. The school year continued, but the following year, Governor Faubus closed Arkansas high schools. Virginia also closed Virginia high schools. The South did not want to play nice with regard to the Supreme Court's requirement to desegregate public schools. The civil rights movement is an uneasy alliance between the federal government and the black community, where neither partner trusted the judgment of the other. The federal government, by and large, believed that segregation was unjust, and there was a need to obey the decision of the Supreme Court and various subordinate courts. Black activists wanted immediate progress and full use of government authority against violators. Some of the more well-known black activists, we might want to start with Rosa Parks, a black seamstress in Montgomery, Alabama. Montgomery had a segregated transportation system, and that meant that blacks were supposed to sit on the back of the bus. There was a black zone, a white zone, and a mixed race zone that blacks could sit in if no whites were present. And at one point, she was in the mixed race zone. A white entered the bus, and she was ordered to move to the back, and she refused. She would be arrested. Out of that problem with Montgomery busing, Martin Luther King would become more well known, and he would lead a boycott of the Montgomery bus system to protest its segregation. He had attended Morehead College at the age of 15. He was ordained at 18 years old. He was a preacher at the Dexter Street Baptist Church, and the head of the Montgomery Improvement Association. And he would choose to fight segregation using ideas that he had learned from Mohandas K. Gandhi. I think there's a picture of King on page 741 in your book. Back on 740, you see a picture of Little Rock High School with federal troops carrying guns. When you look at King's picture, you see Gandhi there up on the wall. Now, one of the things that I always thought was a little ironic is that Gandhi, in turn, had gotten some of his ideas from Henry David Thoreau from Walden, Massachusetts. So the ideas went from Massachusetts to India to Alabama. Not exactly a shortcut. All right, King will lead a year-long boycott of the bus system. His home will be bombed. He ended up sitting up several nights in his living room with a handgun in his lap in case people broke into his home. Another key leader here would be Adam Clayton Powell, who represented the Harlem District of New York, the first black from the East elected to Congress. And he will attach a rider, an addition, or an amendment to Eisenhower's education bills in 1956 and 1957. And the Powell rider said that states who had segregated school systems would not get any share of federal funding. Now, what will happen here? The Supreme Court will rule that segregation of the Alabama public transportation facilities would be illegal. Browder v. Gale in November of '56 is very much taking the Brown versus Board of Education decision and moving it from education to transportation. So that was fairly easy to see. King himself would be the youngest ever recipient of the Spin Iron Medal, the NAACP Annual Achievement Award. He would be inaugurated as president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He would meet with President Eisenhower. And the strategy for nonviolent civil disobedience would bring forth a campaign of sit-ins at restaurants and churches. Blacks would enter a restaurant, get seated, not be served, and they wouldn't leave. They wasted their time. They also wasted the time and space of the restaurant, who wasn't making any money, not selling them any food. Your text points out the impatient vision of Martin Luther King. He plagiarized his doctoral dissertation. He was repeatedly unfaithful to his wife, Coretta Scott King. He deserves credit for his clarity of vision, for his moral and physical courage. What King lacked was the character to always act in a private setting in ways consonant with his publicly expressed faith and philosophy. He is certainly not the first such leader in world history. If we were to look in the Bible, we would see King David, who is staying in the rear in the spring when it's time for the armies to go to war. And then he sees Bathsheba. And next thing you know, we have some lying and some murdering and some adultery going on. All right. We get a Civil Rights Act in 1957, the first one since Reconstruction, achieved under Eisenhower by a coalition of Republicans and a slice of the Democratic Party, led by a Texas legislator, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Now we'll see LBJ continuing to become increasingly important. The Civil Rights Act allowed the Justice Department to bring injunctions against schools on behalf of blacks who were denied the opportunity to see their children attend an integrated school, or against towns who had denied blacks the right to vote. Inside the Justice Department, a Civil Rights Commission was created with the powers to investigate and report violations of civil rights. Now, the South will attack this bill with a filibuster. That is, they will have senators stand up and speak to delay the processing of the bill. And what they wanted was, instead of a judge being able to find a local official in contempt of court, that it would require a jury trial made up of white rednecks who supported the behavior of the town officials, who ensured they would not get convicted by a judge. So we get a Civil Rights Act in 57. It's a very weak, watered down Civil Rights Act. Eisenhower will go back, and at the end of his term ask for a second Civil Rights Act in 1960. And this is going to, again, support black voting rights. It's going to renew the Civil Rights Commission. It's going to institute criminal penalties for blocking racial integration. And it is a stronger bill. It is more like what Ike wanted in 57. It put some teeth in the ability to punish those who were willfully ignoring the Supreme Court's ruling. One very heartening fact is that by the time we get to the 1960 presidential election, where Richard Nixon is the Republican nominee, Jack Kennedy is the Democratic nominee, race and desegregation are not issues because both parties have virtually identical platforms calling for racial integration and racial equality. A step forward. It would take more work to implement those, but both major parties seem committed to do that work. Hey guys, go forth, do great and wonderful things. Stay safe.